Right. Good morning. Most honored to be here in China. I'm the founder and once was the president of the Apache Software Foundation. But these days I mostly sort of like work on the security team. And recently, because of changes in the world, in society, on regulatory things, on public affairs. So that's the business of dealing with governments, with politicians, with policymakers who are really sort of like are taking an interest in our world. That's very boring stuff, but it's also very important stuff. Because what has happened, without us realizing it, is that software and open source by its extension is now as important as electricity, as railroad companies, as roads, as cars, as buildings. So suddenly we are sort of like an important industry. We're a crucial industry. And you really don't want a railroad to crash, or you don't want a bridge to collapse. And in the same way, you don't want software to collapse. And software is now so important all over the world that actually politicians really care about that. If software crashes, if planes stop flying because of a software problem, politicians sort of like have their voters complain to them and not to the industry. Now, if we think of the software industry, if we think of the IT industry, if we think of the incredible things we've built, one of the quotes most people think of is this one from Mark Zuckerberg. It is move fast and break things. And if you're not breaking things, you're not moving fast enough. Now this quote, when Mark said that, he was not being very original. About 200 years earlier, people said exactly the same thing about steam engines. If you're not building steam engines for your factories, if you're not building them fast, if they don't occasionally blow up, you're probably not innovating fast enough. So 200 years ago, people started building steam engines. They built incredible wealth. They made things incredibly much better. But also, things did explode. And that's quite fundamental. Because when something has a very high reward, when something makes society better, like the steam engine, you are sort of like willing to take more risks. And when it occasionally sort of like explodes, you sort of like accept that. But if it doesn't explode, next time you'll take an even bigger risk. So when it goes wrong, kaboom, you have an even bigger explosion. And then sort of like some point later, some brilliant person had the idea of putting these steam engines onto wheels and start moving them around. And these things, of course, exploded too. And politicians, policymakers, they were really fed up with this by the 1960s. And they told industry, you must fix this. They said to the companies, fix this now. And they didn't say it once, they said it twice, they said it many times. In Europe, in the US, all over the world. And the companies, they did absolutely nothing. Until one day, and this is the example of America, but virtually every country has an example like this, until one day the Boston shoe factory in America blew up. And in the Netherlands we have a similar one where basically a gas factory blew up. And that was just too big an explosion, it killed too many people. And what happened then was that not the companies fixed the problems, but the engineers working at competing companies, working at different companies, got informally together and wrote what is now known as the Boiler and Pressure Code, which is valid to this day. So engineers privately got together, working for competing companies, and built the standards that made steam engines safe. And that pattern has repeated in most of the other industries. It's not the companies setting the standards, it's the engineers working together across company borders to set the standards. And if this sounds familiar, well, that's very much what we do in open source. Now, after those disasters, when we have these disasters, typically, when we think of ourselves, when a big disaster is happening, we think ourselves like this. We're working very hard on fixing the disaster. We're trying to clean up the mess. We're doing very positive things. But people outside our community, people sort of like looking at us, looking at our industry, looking at us doing this, they don't see this at all. What they see is this. What they see is this picture. They see a disaster. They see things, people killed, and they see us there as a bunch of committers, just walking around in those ruins. This is what the public sees. This is how people look at us. What's also important is that the risk of a software disaster, whether it's Log4j or XZ, or a couple of days ago in America and Europe, the crowdsource problem, it has a lot of impact. And it's usually not the software companies that actually feel that impact. It's the millions of people who got stranded on their first day of the holiday. And this is a common thing in every industry coming of age. If there is money, if the industry gets bigger and bigger, the side effects of it going wrong, of it going kaboom, also get bigger. Like in this case with CrowdStrike grinding pretty much all the flights around the world. And that is actually a very common economic pattern. You create a product, you innovate, perhaps a bit carelessly, you reduce quality, and you make more profit. Let's say you're doing a bottle of water, and you're selling it, you're making a profit. And then you reduce your quality controls and don't clean the water so well. It's cheaper, and you make more profit. But when it fails, when people get sick, you as a manufacturer, you don't pay the cost of that. Society pays that cost of the sick people. You keep your profit. So this is a very unfair deal. You make more profit as an industry, society bears the cost. And at some point, and for software we've now hit that point, society says no. And basically what they said, it's too important now what you're doing for us humans to sort of like not have it fail. In fact, it's so important that we're willing to have less innovation and willing to have things go slower and have less wealth than it would otherwise bring us when left unchecked. So we as a society are making a very traditional engineering trade-off. We're looking at the benefits, we're looking at the downsides, and we're saying essentially as society, sorry guys in software, you've got to be more careful. And yes, we expect accept that means that we'll have less innovation, less wealth, things will go a bit slower, but we think humans are more important. And the result of that is basically regulation, software regulation, legislation and law changes. And essentially that's something which is being prepared all over the world. And the reason why that's being prepared all over the world is because software, like most trade and industry these days, is global. You have to ship your product to anywhere in the world. I'll take most of the examples from Europe, because Europe is the furthest ahead. But America is not far behind, and depending on the next president, America may actually be quicker, depending a little on the elections there. And most parts of the world, like South America and so on, they're looking at exactly the same sort of things. Because countries generally sort of like move coordinated here when it is about these international trade agreements. So if you sort of like look at the regulatory outlook, there is something called the Product Liability Directive. And this is actually something which is present all over the world. It's also here in China under a different name. And what it basically says is like, if you sell a product, it has to be fit for purpose. It has to be suitable for what it does. So if you sell a hammer, you have to be able to use it to hammer in nails. If you sell drinking water, it has to be suitable for drinking. It doesn't say that the hammer has to be usable for everything. No, only fit for the expected reasonable purpose. And this law basically covers absolutely everything. It covers tables, it covers my laptop here, it covers this pedestal, it covers this microphone. This law really applies to everything. But the list of that law, the list of products it applied to, was made about 40 years ago, the last time it was updated. So what they're doing today now, and actually it starts next year, is they're making a very small update. In the long list of products, just after silverware, they're adding the product software and services. That's basically the only change they're really making to that law. So all of a sudden, software and services are normal products. So they have to be fit for purpose. Fit for purpose also means that if it has a defect, if it has a bug, you as a consumer are entitled for a free replacement or free fixing of that bug. And it must be fixed or you get your money back. And it must be fixed for what is a reasonable period, economic lifetime of the product. So for a lot of companies that will be painful because they live off paid upgrades and things like that. And basically that's essentially no longer possible. Now all of the PLD is about products and the harm they do to humans. So this is not about B2B transactions, this is purely about business to consumer transactions, not business to business. It's all about business to consumer and the consumer accounts. And the PLD has a long list of harm to the consumer, like, and these are usually bodily harm, like losing an arm, losing a finger, losing an eye, getting poisoned, and all these other things. And the politicians are also making a change to that list. They're adding one extra item, and that is the item of emotional distress or caused by data loss or an algorithm making the wrong decision is being added to that list. So if you lose your family photos, or if a software at a doctor makes the wrong decision, that's now also covered under the PLD. So if you had any waivers or disclaimers, like for example the Apache license has, they are no longer valid for consumers. So essentially when you see a software license, a commercial one, and it has a waiver, a disclaimer, a maximization of the damages or whatever else, all that you can remove if you're a consumer. Now, some of this may sound a little bit harsh and a little bit difficult. So let's sort of like go back to the PLD and toy safety, because we've been doing toy safety for a very long time. So the PLD just says make a product that's fit for purpose, but nothing else. That's really sort of like, there's no specificity in it. It just says make fit for purpose. Then more specific regulation comes into play. So for example, for toys, we say, well, actually toys, you have to use, that regulation says, okay, it has to be fit for purpose, and that means the following. It means no poisonous paint. It means a kid should not be able to it should not fit in the nose of a child, or it should not fit in the throat of a child. So there are all these sort of like rules, and you basically see a little tube here, where you sort of like can use to test whether your toy is safe, whether you meet all the requirements. And every toy manufacturer knows this. This is not controversial. All toy manufacturers learned how to do this, how to deal with this, how to make products which work that way. So the reaction of the software industry of saying like, oh, it's impossible to regulate us. Well, actually it isn't. The toy industry has been doing it for a lot longer than us, and it's absolutely no problem there. So what will they sort of like do for us? So first rule is your product, your software has to be fit for purpose, and if it has a defect, you have to replace it freely, or you have to get your money back. So that's quite simple. But then it makes very specific things which are more software specific. And this law is called, in Europe, the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. And that one basically says, if you really sum it up, is you shall do good security. That's basically all it says. And then on top of that, there are much more specific laws and regulations. If your software does infrastructure, if your software does a firewall, if your software does finance, and then suddenly you get very specific rules, like you must do a pen test every year. You must have OWASP checks, and so on. Right, so let's dive into that Cyber Resilience Act, because that's the one which affects open source. The other ones are very industry specific, and that's basically not usually what open source is about. So if there's one thing you should remember from this talk, is that today, basically, once this law goes into operation, you have to do decent security. Not perfect security, but you must do decent security. And when you're doing decent security, the human, the consumer, goes first. So you cannot say, oh, I ship quicker, or I try to make a bit more profit, or this feature is more important. No, when you're in front of a judge, you have to prove that you put the human and its security as the first thing. So practically that means you've got to test, you've got to triage your bugs, you've got to fix them, and so on. And throughout all of that, when you're testing, when you're triaging, when you're fixing, you've got to consider the human first. So suppose you've got a couple of bugs, or you've got some bugs, and one of them is really bad for your users. They lose their family pictures. And the other one is really bad for your payment system. If you don't fix that one, you lose money. Then the law now says you must fix the one that affects the humans first, and the other one can wait. So basically there's now a hierarchy of what you need to sort of like respond first. And essentially what the law says, like basically be a responsible adult. Put not profit, not time of market, but put the customer first. And that's the law, and it's basically that simple. Right, now some of you may have read on the internet that when they originally wrote the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, it was a complete disaster. It basically said open source is illegal. That's pretty much what it said. Over the sort of like last 2 years, a lot of us, like the Apache Software Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, the Python Foundation, the Rust Foundation, lots of us spoke to politicians, and we explained to them open source is really 80% of the software stack. It's really important. And actually, your goal is to make security better. Open source is generally way more secure than proprietary software. So you're doing basically, we didn't say you're doing the wrong thing, but we explained that what they were trying to do would not have the effect they wanted. And to their credit, they listened. They actually did listen to us. And in the very last week, the politicians introduced, especially for us, a new class of economic actor called an open source steward, which is largely exempt or gets a lighter rule than the rest of the industry. So we as open source actually get our own set of rules, which are much easier than the companies get. So the CRA basically says like, okay, well, decent security is now a requirement. It also says waivers, disclaimers, anything like that is now basically out of the window. You can't rely on it. When it involves a natural person, you can't. So this will have an absolutely massive impact on our industry, on the software industry as a whole, and by extension to us open source developers, because we're part of that industry. First of all, certain business models will simply no longer be viable, because if you're doing a business model where you're selling crap software with crap security, well, that's now illegal. So yeah, that's not going, yeah, basically you're out of business. Also, if you have a business model where people have to pay for bug fixes, where people have to pay for fixes and things like that and service, that's probably not going to work either, because people are entitled to free bug fixes for the entire duration of the product. Any defect has to be fixed for free, or you get your money back. So those business models are also going to be problematic. So what the politicians are expecting is that software will get about 30% more expensive, and that smaller companies and companies who are doing bad security will not survive this. So that's actually quite a lot of damage to the industry. And in Europe, sort of like they made the calculations, and you're talking about trillions of euros of damages to the industry. But they've made a business case and actually said like, well, actually, you know what? That's really bad, that damage. But what we win as society, the damage we have from flights stopping and things like that is much higher. So it's still a win. So keep that in mind, that this is a very economic driver behind this. All right, so what's that open source steward? So an open source steward is not just someone making open source. There are quite a few very specific rules. It has to be a legal person other than a manufacturer, so you can't be a manufacturer. That has the purpose or objective, so it has to be really what you do. It doesn't have to be some side thinking, no, it has to be the core of what you do, to systematically provide support on a sustained basis for the development of a specific project with digital elements, qualifying as free and open source, and intended for commercial activities that ensures the viability of those products. So if you break that down, you have to have a main purpose of developing software and to systematically support that and ensure its viability. And it has to be under an open source license, and it has to be intended for commercial activities. So if you make just software as a hobby, or if you just make software for fun, you don't qualify as an open source steward. So essentially what you have here is basically how a lawyer would describe the Apache Software Foundation. Because you have to know that the word a product with digital elements is actually the legal term for what we would normally call software. So essentially what the lawmakers have done is they've codified the Apache Software Foundation's habits in a word called open source stewards, and then they've said that open source stewards, they sort of like have to basically they're not as strict under the law as the industry. Now there is a very old circular reasoning in this. They say open source stewards are exempt from the CRA essentially on the condition that they do basically that they are maintaining their open source very well. So essentially what they're saying, like, you only get exempt if you're an open source foundation that does good security. So there's a circular reasoning in this. So essentially we as open source stewards still have to do all the things commercial companies do, just in essentially a simpler way. So we still have to do that security aspect. Now a lot of the things in the standard or in this law are just legal words, but they are not defined anywhere. Nowhere does it says what reasonable security is. Nowhere does it says what risk-based triage is. Nowhere does it says what responsible disclosure is. We know ourselves what all those things are because at Apache we've been doing them for 20 years, but it isn't really defined. For that, basically, it is expected that there will be international standards written in the next 3 years to sort of like actually describe what these things mean. And if they don't get written, those standards, then essentially what is industry best practice will become the norm. So basically, essentially what we're doing at Apache. So at Apache, basically, the things we're already doing, which is trivial, are CVEs for security bugs. We do something called risk-based triage. So that means when a security issue comes up, we look at how serious it is. And if it's very serious, we act quickly. If it's less serious, we act less quickly. Responsive disclosure. So these things we all do is quite easy. There are two things which are new, which we don't do today. The first one is mandatory secure SBOMs, mandatory secure bill of materials. So basically listing your dependencies and all the versions of that. And the second one is something we actually do, but it's not very formal, that when there is an active exploitation of some security hole, you have to report it to the regulators around the world. We currently do that on a very informal basis, but that basically will become formal. Right, and then sort of like, as I said, basically a lot of these things will require standards, ISO standards, ETSI standards, ITU standards, CEN-ELEC standards to actually define what all of those things mean. What is risk-based triage, what is responsible disclosure, and so on. So one of the things we're doing with our peers at Eclipse, at the Python Foundation, the Rust Foundation, the people of OWASP, and quite a few others, is that we're getting together to essentially sort of like help write those standards, to sort of like make sure that the stuff we do as Apache essentially becomes part of that standard, because we are very worried that the normal standards bodies like ISO and ITU and ETSI and so on, they're not very much experts on software. So basically, we're sort of like getting together as open source companies to organizations to basically try to help write those standards. And that will sort of like be a very international sort of affair where basically anyone is welcome. Right. So now a few words of like about the impact, the effect this regulation will have on us at Apache. Because the expectation is that Europe will probably be first, depending on the American elections. It will get into effect basically the law will come into effect at the end of this year. And then there is a 3-year grace period, and then it becomes really effective, so like by the end of 2027, when the grace period is over. So about the impact, let's start with the bad news. And that is basically the impact on the industry. All of a sudden, every company making software or services in the world has to operate at industry, what we now today call industry best practice level of security. So basically every company around the world has to roughly get as good as doing security as open source is. For most companies that is hard. That is something they've never done. Like if you phone up an average company, let's say a company which makes your fancy internet connected doorbell, and you want to report a security issue to them, most companies don't even know what to do with it. They don't even have a security contact, and they wouldn't really know how to fix that. So now all of a sudden, what we do at Apache is the norm. So that is reacting quickly, reacting immediately, looking at the risk, fixing it, doing a new release, testing it, peer reviewing it, and sort of like then pushing out the release and everything else. So this is something which basically will be a lot of work for our industry, a lot of change for our industry, and it will cost an enormous amount of money. One thing I did sort of like, oh, sorry, you should. Okay, sorry, you should be seeing this page. Basically, sort of like the impact there, sort of like, is getting sort of like to that industry, sort of like best practice level for the whole industry. One thing I forgot to tell, one thing is I avoided, that there is a set of very special products which are under much more stringent rules. Those are web browsers, password managers, chip cards, and firewalls. For these products, you actually have to get certification from an external party. And a lot of the exemptions for open source don't apply to this section of products. So if you're having an open source browser, yes, there will be some real complexity for you. Right, so like over to the good news. So the impact on the Apache Software Foundation and on the wider engineering community. So the first thing is that all of a sudden, what most of us here do, and most of us enjoy doing, is good software, writing good software, writing safe software, writing stable software. And actually now, decent software engineering is no longer an option. Testing is no longer optional. Maintaining your software well is no longer optional. Making sure that your dependencies are up to date, it's no longer optional. It is quite simply now the law. So that also means that as engineers, our relation with product managers, with our bosses changes. Because all of a sudden, there are things which simply need to be done. On the Apache Software Foundation ourselves, basically the impact of all these rules and regulations isn't that bad. Because the regulators looked a lot at the incubator, they looked a lot at our security processes, and essentially said what Apache is doing is industry best practice. So actually we don't have to do very much except for example, like adding S-bombs everywhere. And also I'm expecting that there will be an indirect effect where a lot of companies will actually come to the Apache Software Foundation to actually work with us, work here as part of the community to sort of like fix things, to sort of like help themselves basically to better software and processes. So remember this, that basically sort of like once the CRA is into force, society, the people have your back. So when it's choice between good security or a new feature, good security sort of like will now win. Even no matter how commercial your company, that's basically the law now. So to sort of like summarize things, regulation is for real. First in Europe, then in the US, and then in the rest of the world. The law is well written. There are no loopholes. And it really is expected that this will make software 30% more expensive. That you will need 30% more engineers to do all your security really well. And that's an engineering trade-off made by politicians. They accept these higher costs in return for better security. It will sort of like basically mean changes for us, but actually the open source model still stands. We can still do all the things we sort of like normally do. Basically the way we work around security and things basically now becomes the norm. So one of the things sort of like, of course, which we will do sort of like at Apache is that we will have to document things a lot better. We will have to introduce S-bombs. We will have to sort of like improve our CI and CD and all these sort of like other things. So that's obviously something where we as the community sort of like can all help each other. And so finally, sort of like one last thing is, you are important to society, software is important to society. Society wants us to be responsible engineers. So the wisest thing here is don't fight that, but embrace that. Celebrate good engineering and know that now all of a sudden you've got the support, not of your bosses, but of society as a whole. Thank you.